Hey guys, today we're at Acts chapter 25. We left off yesterday with the governor Felix leaving, a new governor coming in. His name was Festus, and Paul was left in prison, right? So today we picked up in chapter 24 with Festus coming on. Now, Felix wasn't a great governor. Festus was pretty good. I mean, historically, he seemed to be a fair governor. And we can even see the beginnings of this, where at the very beginning of 25, after 3 days of being in his office, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So he's going around his province. He's meeting people. He's seeing how things are run. He's being what we would say is a good politician, right? Going around, kissing the baby, shaking hands, right? Just doing his political kind of campaign. And so as he goes to Jerusalem, we see that the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. It's been over 2 years Paul has been in prison with Governor Felix, right? So it's been over 2 years. Now the new governor comes in, and the first time they see him, they instantly bring up Paul. You can see how much hatred they have against Paul, right? It's been 2 years. They have not let it go. They have not forgot about it. They bring up, Paul's a bad man. We want him dead, right? And so it goes on, and it says, asking us a favor against Paul, that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning to ambush and kill him on a way. Many times in our Christian lives, we think bad things happen to us. We think that God puts us in bad positions. Being in prison for over 2 years for something that we didn't do, I think we all would express that maybe God has made a mistake. Maybe God has put us in this, that maybe God is bad, and maybe even there isn't a God. What's interesting is Paul's in prison for over 2 years, and we see that as a bad thing. But as mad as the Jews are, and they are waiting to ambush and kill him, prison was not prison. It was God's grace and mercy of keeping Paul in protective custody, right? I mean, he's in prison, so the Jews can't kill him. He had freedom. People could come and see him. People could attend to his needs. But he was kind of what we would say on kind of house arrest, right? So what we see sometimes as bad is really God's grace and mercy, right? And so not only is it protective custody, but remember what Paul has done. The last 20 years, he has traveled the world and almost died many times sharing the gospel. So 2 years in jail is a rest. It's a break. It's a vacation. And so just sometimes we got to look better at what the bad things are in life, and maybe God is allowing these bad things to happen for his good, and sometimes for our good, right? So little sermon thought there. So we can see that the Jews are upset. And so Festus says, hey, I'm not going to bring him to Jerusalem, but I'm headed back home to Caesarea in a few days. Why don't you come with me, and then I'll sit down and I'll hear what you have to say. And so verse 6, 8, 10 days later, they go down to Caesarea. He sits in his seat, his judgment seat, the tribunal seat. And Paul comes in, and notice what it says, right? It says, verse 7, the Jews who came from Jerusalem, they could not prove. They had no proof of what they're saying, right? Paul argued his defense, and he said this, I have not broken any laws of the Jews. I have not broken any laws of the temple, and I have not broken any of the laws of Caesar. And so Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Festus was a smart enough politician to know that even though he's new, it's good to have the leaders of the Jews on your team. Remember, Festus is a governor over a Jewish province. Even though he's Rome, and even though Rome has the authority over it, all of his people are Jewish. So he kind of needs them, right? He kind of needs them in his back pocket to say that, yeah, he's good and that what he says will go. But he also knows that he cannot send a Roman citizen to an Israel court to be tried and to be killed because he's a Roman citizen. So here he asked Paul, hey, is this what you want? Because if Paul said yes, if Paul was dumb enough to say yes, then he would send them there and they would kill him, and it's a win-win for the governor and for the Jews, right? But Paul, being smart enough, maybe by the Holy Spirit, maybe just because he's an intelligent man, right? He says, no, that's not a good idea, right? That's not a good idea. And he says, but I'm standing in Caesar's tribunal. I'm standing in Caesar's court. I'm a Roman citizen. We're having this, right? You need to say something. This is where I ought to be tried. To the Jews, I have done no wrong. As for yourself, you know very well, right? Because if Festus could charge him with something, he would have already done it, right? But he doesn't. He doesn't charge him because there's nothing to charge with. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. He's basically saying, I'm innocent. You know I'm innocent. They know I'm innocent. And so you can't give them to me, you can't give me to the Jews because I am innocent. You can't do that, right? So he says, I appeal to Caesar. He wants to go all the way to Rome and appeal to the king of the world, right? Where he thinks that he can get a fair trial of someone who's not being swayed by these Jewish elites. Then Festus heard this, and he said, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you will go. Okay, I will send you to Caesar, right? But until then, he has to stay in prison. He has to remain a prisoner, right? And then we see verse 13, a guy comes. It says Agrippa the king. Now, we've heard this before. This is King Herod Agrippa the second, all right? There's the first, there's the second. And Bernice. Bernice is his sister. But in history outside of the Bible, in secular history, they were lovers. They were incestuous. And so this tells you their moral standard, right? It's just gross. So Herod and his wife, his sister, his whatever lover, whatever you want to call it, but it's his sister. They arrive and they greet Festus because they were governors to the province northeast of Israel. Okay, so they had provinces that were touching, and they'd been there for a while, so they're coming down to meet the new governor, right? That seems very common. And so they stay there for Festus for a while. Festus tells them the idea about Paul, and basically he says, I found nothing wrong with Paul. He's not guilty of anything, but the Jews still want to see him. In verse 18, he even says, the accusers stood up. They brought no charge of him. Rather, they had certain points of dispute. They had things that they disagreed with about their own religion. It's a religious matter, not a civil, not a government matter. And about a man named Jesus, whom the Jews said was dead, Paul said was alive, right? So Paul has even preached the gospel to this new governor, Festus, when he met with him, right? And so King Herod Agrippa, he's like, man, this is good, right? This is better than a soap opera. I kind of want to see this, right? And so Festus says, absolutely, I'd love to have your input. You have been a governor longer than me. So yes, I welcome your input. And so we see verse 23, on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came in with great pomp. So now it's not just a civil suit, not just a lawyer, but it's circumstance, right? And pomp. It's everybody. We see they're in an audience hall. They're no longer at at the tribune seat that the governor would sit in to say guilty, not guilty. They're not in the courtroom anymore. Not only in the audience hall, there's military tributes, there's prominent men. This is a show. This is a spectacular show, okay? Then Paul was brought in, and all this happens. And the Jews started screaming, shouting that he ought not to live longer. But I found, right? So Festus is kind of going over the last case, right? The Jews want him dead. I found nothing wrong with him. So this is why we're doing this circumstance, right? This pomp and circumstance, so that King Agrippa might hear this and maybe find some evidence. Even verse 26, it says, but I have nothing defined to write to my Lord about him. He basically says, I have no charge to write even up against Paul if I send him to Caesar. And we see it again in verse 27, for it seems to be unreasonable in sending a prisoner and not to indicate the charges against him. Can you imagine being Caesar, and there's a guy that's coming to him, to the Caesar, to the king of the world, right, and saying, I need you to adjudicate this case because I couldn't figure it out. This guy's innocent. I have no problem with him. But these people say that they do, but he's not guilty. But I need you to say that, right? That Caesar would be so mad at the governor sending him, saying, you can't even adjudicate this simple case. And maybe he would kick that governor out of his seat, right? So he either needs King Agrippa to agree with him, he's not guilty, and then just let him go so he doesn't have to go to Caesar, or King Agrippa would find something that's wrong so he would have a charge that he could write and he could send him away, right? At the end of the day, Festus is looking to get rid of this problem. Paul against the leader of the Jews, there's a problem. He either needs to say he's innocent, let him go, and the Jews is going to kill him anyways, or send him to Rome, but I need something to tell Caesar what's wrong with him, right? So that's chapter 25. I hope that makes a little bit more sense, and we will see you tomorrow on chapter 26. God bless.